Welcome to the deep dive. And thanks everyone for sending in this really interesting material. Our mission today,
Yeah.
we're doing a crash course, a real deep dive into
Okay.
international trade. It's such a core concept in economics, but it gets thrown around a lot without maybe always understanding the basics. We really need to understand how countries benefit, who might lose out, and importantly, how governments try to shape it all.
Exactly. We're going to get right into the economic principles behind it. We'll figure out why countries trade in the first place based on some core ideas. Then we'll use the trusty supply and demand framework to see what happens when imports and exports hit the domestic economy. And finally, yeah, we have to talk about the policy debates, the politics, and how globalization actually affects your life.
Okay, but before we jump into the theory, maybe a quick activity, just for relevance. Look around you right now, wherever you are. How many things near you, maybe your shirt, your phone, even the pen you're holding, how many were actually made, domestically in your own country?
Yeah, take a second.
For most people, I suspect that number is pretty low, maybe even zero for some things. And that little check, that just shows how much global trade is part of our everyday lives, right?
Absolutely. It's woven into everything.
Okay, so let's get started. What's the fundamental driver here? Is it really just as simple as saying, well, foreign goods are cheaper, so we buy them, or is there something deeper going on?
Well, the cheaper price is often the result, yes. But the reason behind that lower price, that's where the core principle lies. It's called comparative advantage. That's the engine. You import when foreign products are cheaper, sure, and your local companies export when they can get a better price selling abroad. But why are those prices different? That's the key.
Comparative advantage. Okay.
It's all about opportunity cost.
Hmm.
Comparative advantage just means you can do a particular task at a lower opportunity cost than someone else can. It means you specialize in what you're relatively best at, meaning what you give up the least to do, and then you trade for the other stuff.
Okay, opportunity cost. That's the value of the next best alternative you give up, right?
Yeah.
So it's not about being the absolute best at everything.
Precisely. It's not about absolute advantage. That's a common misconception. Think about a really successful chef. Let's use the Gordon Ramsay example. It's a good one. Imagine Ramsay is literally the best chef and the fastest dishwasher in the world. He's amazing at both.
Okay.
But what's the opportunity cost if he spends an hour washing dishes? It's enormous, right? He's giving up the chance to design a new menu, manage his restaurant empire, film a TV show, things that generate huge value.
Right, he'd lose a ton of money or value compared to just hiring a dishwasher.
Exactly. Even if he's technically a better dishwasher than the person he hires, the opportunity cost of him doing the dishes is just too high. So he specializes in cooking and managing, his relative strength, and pays someone to do the dishes. That same logic applies between people, between companies, and between countries. Geography doesn't change the principle.
That clicks. So countries specialize where their opportunity cost is lowest and trade for the rest. But there must be costs involved in trading internationally, right? It can't be frictionless.
Absolutely. And that's a crucial point. International trade only makes sense if the price difference between the imported good and the domestic one is big enough to cover the trade costs.
Trade costs, like shipping fees, tariffs.
Taxes.
Those are the big monetary ones, yes. Shipping, import, export, taxes, tariffs are a big one we'll come back to. But don't forget the non-monetary costs. Think about language barriers, different time zones making coordination tricky, navigating foreign laws, regulations, bureaucracy.
Yeah, all that adds friction and costs.
It does. So when you buy that imported shirt, the price difference had to be big enough to overcome all that hassle, essentially.
And this ties into globalization, right? The idea that these trade costs have been falling. Exactly. A huge driver of modern globalization has been the reduction in these trade costs. Think about standardized shipping containers, a massive innovation, made logistics way cheaper and more predictable. Then technology like email, video calls, translation software. It slashed the communication and coordination costs, cheaper air freight, cheaper ocean shipping. It all adds up to make global trade much easier than it used to be.
Okay, so comparative advantage drives it, and falling trade costs enable more of it. What actually gives a country a comparative advantage in something, though? Where does that specialization come from?
Good question. The sources point to three main factors. First, abundant inputs. This is probably the most intuitive one. Does a country have lots of oil? Or a climate perfect for growing coffee? Or maybe a large pool of skilled labor from past investments? Think Saudi Arabia and oil, Brazil and coffee. They leverage what they have in relative abundance compared to others. And an interesting point here, the bigger the difference in these relative inputs between trading partners, the bigger the potential gains from trading with each other.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
If one country has tons of lumber and another has tons of iron ore, they have a lot to gain by specializing in trading.
Precisely. The second source is specialized skill. This is about developing unique know-how, specific production techniques, or expertise that builds up over time. Think about regions famous for watchmaking or a specific type of manufacturing. They get better and more efficient through learning by doing.
Like Silicon Valley for tech, maybe?
Could be argued, yeah. That concentration of skill and knowledge. And the third factor is about scale. The benefits of mass production. Think about something like IKEA's Billy bookcase. They sell millions.
Right.
Producing it at massive scale lets them invest in hyper-specialized, super-efficient production lines. That drives the cost per unit way down. Plus, when you're buying materials for millions of bookcases, you get incredible bargaining power with suppliers. Cheaper wood, cheaper hardware. That sheer scale becomes its own source of comparative advantage. It's hard for smaller producers to compete on price.
Okay, abundant inputs, specialized skills, and mass production benefits. Those are the sources.
Right. So now we know why trade happens. Let's get into the consequences. What happens when imports or exports start flowing? To figure this out, economists use the domestic supply and demand model, but they compare it against the world price.
World price.
Yeah.
That's just the prevailing global price for a good.
Exactly. Determined by global supply and demand. And for this analysis, we usually assume the country we're looking at is a relatively small player, a price taker, meaning our buying or selling doesn't really move that big world price needle.
Okay, let's take an import example. Say, T-shirts. Let's imagine the world price for a basic T-shirt is $12.
Yeah.
But if we didn't trade, our domestic market price would settle at $20.
Perfect setup. Now we apply a simple three-step logic. Step 1. What happens to the price in our domestic market? It immediately falls to match the world price. Why would any consumer pay $20 when they can get an identical imported shirt for $12?
Right, the price drops to $12. Competition forces it down.
Step 2. How do domestic buyers and sellers react to this new, lower price? Well, buyers love it. At $12, the quantity demanded domestically goes up. People buy more shirts. But domestic producers, they hate it. At $12, it's less profitable, maybe unprofitable for some, so the quantity supplied domestically goes down.
So demand up, domestic supply down.
Yeah.
There's a gap.
Step 3. That gap is filled by imports. If, say, at $12, consumers want 140 million shirts, but domestic firms only produce 40 million, the difference, 100 million shirts, comes from imports.
Okay, that makes sense mechanically. But what about the overall impact? Who wins, who loses?
This is the crucial part for understanding the politics. Let's talk economic surplus. Consumers are clear winners. They pay less, $12 instead of $20, and they get to buy more shirts. Big gain for them. Domestic producers are clear losers. They get a lower price, and they sell less quantity due to the foreign competition. They lose surpluses.
Okay, winners and losers, that sounds like a wash, maybe.
But it's not. This is the key economic insight. The gain to consumers, the benefit they get from lower prices and more availability, is greater than the loss suffered by the domestic producers. So, even though some lose, the total economic surplus for the country as a whole increases. Society, in aggregate, is better off.
Wait, hang on. That's tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're saying even if a whole town's factory shuts down because of cheap imports displacing hundreds of workers, economically, the country's still better off because millions of other people save a few dollars on a T-shirt.
That's exactly the calculation, yes. And it highlights the core tension. The losses are often very concentrated, visible, and painful for specific groups and communities, like that factory town. The gains, however, are spread thinly across millions and millions of consumers. That $8 saved per shirt adds up across the whole economy to be larger than the factory's losses, but it's less visible. The economic pie gets bigger, but the slices are redistributed, and some slices shrink dramatically.
Okay, that clarifies why trade debates get so heated. The overall gain doesn't feel like a gain to those who lose their jobs. Let's flip it. Exports. Let's think we're good at making snowmobiles. Our domestic no-trade price is $9,000, but the world price is higher, say $12,000.
Okay, same 3 steps. Step 1. What happens to the domestic price? It rises to meet the world price. Domestic producers aren't going to sell for $9,000 at home if they can get $12,000 selling abroad.
Price goes up to $12,000.
Step 2. How do domestic buyers and sellers react? Producers love this. Higher price means more profit. The quantity supplied domestically goes up. They ramp up production. Domestic consumers, not so happy. The price is higher. The quantity demanded domestically goes down. Fewer locals buy snowmobiles.
So supply up, domestic demand down. Now we have a surplus.
Step 3, that surplus is exported. If producers make, say, 70,000 snowmobile at $12,000, but domestic consumers only buy 40,000, the extra 30,000 gets sold overseas.
And the winners and losers here. Domestic producers are winning big higher price, more sales. Domestic consumers are losing, they pay more and buy less.
Correct. But again, what about the total economic surplus? The gain to the producers from the higher price and expanded market is greater than the loss suffered by domestic consumers paying more. So, once again, total economic surplus for the country increases. Exports, like imports, make the nation as a whole economically better off on average.
So whether importing or exporting, the standard economic model says total surplus goes up, net benefit.
That's the standard finding, yes.
Which brings us back to the politics. If the net effect is positive, why is there constant debate and pushback against free trade?
It really comes down to that distribution issue we highlighted. Import-competing businesses and their workers face direct, often significant, losses. They feel the pain acutely. Exporters and the consumers who benefit from cheaper imports. Their gains are often less direct or spread out. The losers have a much stronger incentive to organize, lobby, and fight against trade policies that harm them compared to the diffuse winners.
That makes a lot of sense. Concentrated losses versus diffuse gains. Okay, so that sets up the next big question. If free trade generally increases the size of the economic pie, why do governments so often try to restrict it? What are the arguments for protectionism?
Right, because that basic supply and demand story, while powerful, doesn't capture everything. Opponents raise other concerns, often non-economic ones, to justify intervention.
Like national security, that one comes up a lot.
Definitely. The national security argument. The idea is we need to be able to produce certain essential things, maybe weapons, critical medicines, semiconductors, steel right here at home, even if it costs more.
Yeah.
You don't want to rely on a potential adversary for something vital during a crisis or war.
Seems reasonable on the surface.
It can be, but the counter-argument is that this concern is often, let's say, overused or exaggerated. For many essential goods, there isn't just one foreign supplier. There might be dozens of friendly or neutral countries exporting it. So complete dependence on a rival might be rarer than claimed. It can sometimes be used as an excuse to protect an industry that just isn't competitive.
Okay, what else? I've heard the infant industry argument.
Yes, protecting new infant domestic industries from established foreign competitors. The idea is to give them temporary shelter, maybe with tariffs or quotas, allowing them time to grow, learn, become efficient, and eventually compete on their own globally.
Temporary being the key word there.
Supposedly. But in practice, that temporary protection often becomes permanent. Governments aren't always great at picking which industries will actually become successful. And once an industry gets protected, it's politically very hard to remove that protection later, even if the industry never really becomes efficient. Consumers end up paying higher prices indefinitely to prop it up.
Right. Another one is about fairness, like anti-dumping.
Yeah. Dumping is when a foreign firm sells goods in another country below their cost of production or below their home market price. Anti-dumping laws are meant to prevent this, especially if the fear is predatory pricing, drive out domestic competitors, then jack up prices once you have a monopoly.
Sound bad. So we should stop that.
Well, it's tricky. Sometimes what looks like dumping is just the foreign firm having a genuine comparative advantage. They really can produce it that cheaply. In those cases, anti-dumping rules might just be preventing consumers from getting really low prices. It's hard to prove the predatory intent versus just being more efficient.
Okay. What about regulations? Can trade be a way to, dodge rules?
That's a big one. The skirting regulations argument. If your country has, say, strict environmental laws, minimum wage laws, or rules against child labor, those add costs to production. Trade can allow firms to move production to countries without those rules, lowering their costs. So some argue for trade restrictions to prevent this race to the bottom and uphold domestic social standards or agreements.
And the most direct impact, job loss.
Undeniably, yes. Trade liberalization does cause job losses in those domestic industries that compete with imports. That T-shirt factory example. The economic counterargument isn't that jobs aren't lost, but that trade also creates new jobs elsewhere in the economy.
Where?
In the export sectors, the snowmobile factory needs more workers. Also, in related services, logistics, transportation, finance supporting trade, and often the argument goes these new jobs might be in higher productivity, higher paying sectors where the country has a comparative advantage. But the transition can be very painful for those displaced.
Okay, there are these parables you mentioned in the sources that help illustrate this job shifting idea. The Iowa car crop.
Right, it's a great mental model, it asks. How can America get cars? Method 1, build them in a factory in Detroit. That creates manufacturing jobs. Method 2, grow corn in Iowa, where America has a strong comparative advantage. Export the corn. Use the money earned from corn exports to import high-quality cars from, say, Japan or Germany. This second method also creates American jobs, but they're in agriculture, farming, transport, etc., not car manufacturing. Trying to save the Detroit job by blocking the imported car just hurts the Iowa farmer and makes cars more expensive for everyone. It shifts resources away from where we're most productive.
So it reframes it not as job destruction, but job reallocation.
Exactly. To our areas of strength. The sunlight parable tackles the unfairness argument, too.
How does that one go?
Imagine domestic candle makers petitioning the government. Their complaint: the sun. They argue the sun provides light for free, competing unfairly with their candle business. They demand the government block out windows or tax sunlight to level the playing field.
That sounds ridiculous.
Of course it does, but the source argues that many complaints about unfair foreign competition sound just as illogical if you probe them. Often the foreign competitor isn't being unfair, they just have a lower opportunity cost, better technology, or cheaper inputs, essentially. They are the economic equivalent of the sun in that industry. Blocking them just hurts consumers.
Okay, powerful points. But governments do intervene. What are their main policy tools if they decide they want to restrict trade?
The most common is probably the tariff. It's simply a tax levied on imported goods. When an imported good comes in, the government slaps an extra percentage or fixed amount onto its price.
And the effect?
It directly increases the cost of importing, making the foreign good more expensive in the domestic market. This helps domestic producers because it reduces the price advantage of the imports. They can potentially raise their prices or sell more. It also generates tax revenue for the government. So politically, it can seem like a win-win for domestic industry and the Treasury. However, going back to our surplus analysis, tariffs raise prices for consumers, reduce overall consumption, shrink the volume of trade, and ultimately reduce the country's total economic surplus. The losses outweigh the gains.
Okay, tariffs or taxes. What about import quotas?
A quota is different. It's not a tax, but a direct limit on the physical quantity of a good that can be imported. Like only 1 million foreign cars can be imported this year, period.
How does that compare to a tariff?
It has a similar effect on raising the domestic price and reducing the quantity of imports, thereby helping domestic producers. But here's the key difference. A quota does not generate revenue for the government. Instead, the extra profit created by the artificially restricted supply, the difference between the world price and the higher domestic price, usually goes to whoever is lucky enough to get the licenses to import under the quota. It creates what economists call quota rents.
I see. And there's also exchange rate manipulation mentioned.
Yes, that's a more indirect tool. A government can deliberately keep its currency's value artificially low compared to other currencies. Think about China being accused of keeping the yuan low relative to the dollar.
How does that affect trade?
A cheap yuan makes Chinese goods seem very inexpensive to Americans. Good for U.S. consumers, bad for U.S. firms competing with Chinese imports. But it also makes American exports seem very expensive to Chinese buyers. Bad for U.S. exporters. So it subsidizes imports and penalizes exports effectively. It's a way to boost industries that compete with imports, but it hurts exporting sectors.
Okay, so tariffs, quotas, exchange rates, tools governments use, often despite the overall economic case for freer trade.
Pretty much. The political and social factors often weigh heavily.
So wrapping up, let's bring it back to the big picture. Globalization and its effects, especially on workers. There's this fear, right, that connecting with lower wage economies will drag everyone's wages down, that U.S. wages will eventually fall to levels in, say, Mexico or China.
That fear exists, yeah. But the economic logic suggests it's not that simple or immediate. Why? Because wages are fundamentally linked to productivity. The sources mention that, on average, an American manufacturing worker is significantly more productive, maybe something like 12 times more productive than their counterpart in China.
Why such a big difference?
Access to better technology, more capital investment per worker, better infrastructure, more efficient management practices, stronger legal systems. Lots of factors. As long as that large productivity gap exists, wages won't equalize. American workers command higher wages because they produce much more value per hour. So a complete collapse of U.S. wages down to developing country levels isn't seen as likely, at least not anytime soon, because of that productivity advantage.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring. But you mentioned earlier that globalization does impact inequality.
Yes. That's the flip side and a very real consequence. Globalization appears to contribute to rising income inequality within countries like the US. It tends to increase the demand for high-skilled workers who are often involved in complex export-oriented industries or managing global operations. Their wages go up. At the same time, it increases the competition faced by low-skilled workers, particularly those in manufacturing sectors that compete directly with imports from lower-wage countries. Their wages tend to stagnate or even fall, so it pulls the top and bottom further apart.
Which creates that social tension we keep coming back to. And it leads to really difficult moral questions, especially when we see reports about very low wages, maybe less than $2 an hour, and poor working conditions in factories abroad making goods we buy. Opponents say buying those goods makes us complicit, that it's immoral.
It's a powerful moral argument, and this is where, again, the economic concept of opportunity cost forces a really challenging perspective. When confronted with the argument that it's immoral to buy a shirt made by someone earning $2 an hour in potentially grim conditions, the economist has to ask the difficult question, or what?
Meaning, what's the alternative for that worker?
Exactly. If consumers in rich countries stop buying those cheap imported shirts because of moral concerns, what happens to that worker earning $2 an hour? Does she suddenly get a better job? Or is the most likely alternative for her an even worse job, maybe in subsistence agriculture, or informal street vending, or something even more precarious, likely offering an even lower effective wage or worse conditions? Often, that $2 an hour factory job, however bad it seems to us, might be the best available opportunity that specific person has in their local economy.
Wow, that really complicates the moral picture. It's not a simple case of exploitation versus non-exploitation. It's comparing the current situation to the likely alternative.
Precisely. It forces you to weigh the imperfections of the current system against the potential consequences of disrupting it, especially for the very people you're trying to help.
So, maybe the final thought for you, the listener, to really chew on is this.
Yeah.
How do we balance these very real, very valid moral concerns about labor standards and conditions in other countries with the economic reality, framed by opportunity cost, that participating in global trade, even with its flaws, often represents the best available pathway, however difficult for workers in poorer countries to improve their lives? How do we navigate that tension between our values and the complex economic realities on the ground?
That's really the multi-trillion-dollar question underlying almost all international economic policy debates today. There are no easy answers.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.